BBOR, Black Box Online Radio, coming to you from West Virginia. Today we're going back to 2008 to discuss a perhaps lesser-known case out there in the true crime world, and that is the case of Tausha Fields Morton. Sometimes she's referred to as Tausha Fields, and sometimes she's referred to as Tausha Morton. She actually uses a variety of names because before the age of 30, she was actually married 4 times. And this is going to get into something about the concept of psychological manipulation. And we're going to talk about how that is relevant to the true crime world, because we mentioned this on a few different uploads on this channel. The reason why I decided to do an upload about this case is I have to flat out tell you, I was just curious. I saw this one on Dateline 48 Hours or something like that about 5 or 6 years ago, and it was something that I was remembering back when we were talking about some other cases like In Young Yu and some other things about even Charles Manson, people who can kind of manipulate other people into doing certain criminal activities. And I thought I wanted somewhat of a refresher on the case of Tausha Fields. But at the same time, I thought maybe I shouldn't do something for BBOR because it's probably not going to get 1 million views or anything. Right, I gotta worry about that. Then I realized, no, I don't. I mean, just because this is one that is not super well known, it's good to have a discussion about these things from time to time. The reason why I started this YouTube channel was I was just curious about the true crime cases as well, and I felt that I just couldn't stay silent about it. So what better way to do that than to be discussing the case of Tausha Fields Morton. And we have an article here that we are going to be looking through, and also something from the Columbia Tribune that is going to be talking about this case to give us a little bit of an aid. She was described as a seductress, a manipulator, and a murderer. In total, some 7 former boyfriends and or husbands testified or were mentioned during the murder trial, with similar stories regarding Tausha Fields, a 34-year-old woman convicted of plotting her ex-husband's murder. Yesterday, a Boone County judge sentenced Fields to life in prison, and by yesterday they mean that this was written in 2010, sentenced her to life in prison without the possibility of parole. In 2004, Fields lured her then-husband, Mitchell Kemp, to a farm where she was living with her boyfriend, Greg Morton, outside of Columbia, Missouri. Once there, Morton shot Kemp to death, along with Fields, buried the body. So meaning that it was actually her husband that shot Mitchell Kemp to death, and then Tausha Fields and Greg Morton were involved with burying the body. That alone is its own illegal activity. We talked about this with the case of Casey Anthony and the murder of her daughter Kaylee. Alleged murder. Sorry. Innocent until proven guilty, right? As well as also the case of Brooke Schuyler Richardson. Improper disposal of corpses. Illegal in its own activity. Even if she wasn't found guilty on anything else, they would probably get her for that. But Morton later pled guilty to the crime and testified against Fields, and that would be Greg Morton. One of the things, though, about Tausha Fields is I highly recommend that everybody check out the kind of special that they did called The Temptation of Tausha Fields, where it's like you had this woman who was very good at getting men into her life. She was very good at seducing and manipulating men. That's how they kind of introduced this article right here. She was described as a seductress and a murderer, and a manipulator and a murderer. She was described as a seductress and a manipulator. Yeah, they did say murderer too, but how did she manipulate and seduce men? Well, she did it with sex. Let's just say that. So this isn't a super profound thing. But there were some other things about it, like she would come up with these stories, almost like pathological lying, where she would say that she was the victim of abuse growing up, that both her parents were deceased, and that they had abused her for years, and all of that was not true. The events that she was describing did not happen. Not to mention that at the time she was making the claims that her parents were deceased, they were still alive. She was just the type of pathological liar that was very good at getting people to believe her stories. And some people think that that is somewhat due to her bubbly personality. And if you also want to see something else about the case of Tausha Fields, they did an episode of Snapped about her. You know, Snapped, Women Who Kill. That was something that I was just watching last night. So in addition to some of the other kind of text-based articles out here, one of the things that I have to say, though, is on YouTube and even in print, I really found that there were not that many articles covering the cases. That's why I kind of introduced it as something lesser known. And to kind of give a dosage of brutal honesty, when I was looking at, some of the things in Snapped Women Who Kill and some of the photos of Tausha Fields, I was really reminded of my first initial reaction back maybe 5 years ago when I saw the documentary The Temptation of Tausha Fields. I was like, I guess she's maybe a 6.5 or something. I just didn't find her that attractive, and I didn't see how, she was so good at getting guys to kind of throw their lives down in honor of her. I wasn't really attracted to her. But then I was remembered about something that we mentioned on this channel in regards to just kind of true crime and lust and greed and jealousy. Somebody left a comment once on one of the Missy Beavers uploads that I did. And we mentioned this in the most recent Missy Beavers upload Q&A, where they said that Missy Beavers was not attractive, by far, not at all. And yes, that person is just making a poor taste comment. That person was just kind of trolling. But at the same time, what I said in the Q&A was, somebody might have looked at her, some guy in his 50s or 60s might have thought that she was very attractive. And most of the men that were going after Tausha Fields were much older than her. Something to do with the concept of sugar daddy and gold digging, and I think you can get the idea. Some people who are much older would probably find her very attractive. But beauty is also in the eye of the beholder, mind you. But the thing is, though, that she would come up with these stories. She tells lots of lies. She can go from one relationship to the next. The day she gets divorced, she runs off and tries to marry somebody else. That type of kind of fast-moving personality. And that's some of the things, though, that were also involved was that the individual that she was working with, Greg Morton, later pled guilty to the crime and testified against Fields, whom he later married, and from whom he's now divorced. And yes, of course, they divorced, and then, the spouse testifying against the other spouse, that can cause some complications. At the time of the murder, Kemp and Fields were arguing over custody of their newborn daughter, Lexi, at age 7. Excuse me. Fields later moved to Texas, where she was arrested and charged with the crime in 2008. Once again, that's the murder of her husband, her ex-husband, of course, Mitchell Kemp. And then she was delivered to the authorities, and she brought them to the spot where Mitchell Kemp was buried. In an interview with the Columbia Tribune, one of Fields' more recent paramours, Denver Workman of Wilmington, Delaware, describes how he got out of the relationship with Fields with his life, but without his truck. So, as you see, she is also involved with a variety of illegal activities. What I would say, though, is this is an instance where you have a woman who is organizing the murder. She is carrying out the psychological aspects of it. And the reason why we say that this is psychological manipulation is because she is so blatantly lying about all of the aspects of her life. She's trying to make it seem like she is a victim of all of these horrendous atrocities that never took place. She's putting somebody in this type of false sense of awareness so that they think that Tausha is the victim, when in reality, Tausha's the one creating all of these things for greed and for power and getting off on the manipulation. And once this source is no longer valuable, then they have to move to the next source. And I've mentioned a few times that I watched the YouTube channel from Dr. Ramani talking about narcissism, and this is something that she mentioned that is kind of a trait with narcissists, is that they move from one partner to the next. They very frequently change partners, and they very frequently kind of change their the person that they're around, because people cannot tolerate their bullshit. People cannot tolerate their lies. People cannot tolerate their wrongdoings for very long. So eventually the narcissist has to move from person to person. We might be seeing elements of that in Tausha Fields. But at the same time, though, this is something where, once again, we just don't really have that many documentaries and presentations on this case, as well as even people talking about it on podcasts. Perhaps, though, because it's a rather simple story. There's a woman who told lies to men so she could be in relationships with them and get what she wants. But you see this in various other things. Like, we've talked about the case of In Young-yu on the channel recently. She was the South Korean international student who kind of coaxed, coerced, and manipulated her boyfriend into committing suicide in Boston earlier this year. And, she's being charged with involuntary manslaughter because psychological manipulation is not something that should be downplayed. It's not even to the point where her husband, Greg Morton, would have even had the awareness that what was really happening was really happening. That's why we're calling it psychological manipulation. It's got to the point, though, where he thinks that the scenario is different. He, I believe from his own testimony at the trial, is saying that he was under the impression that Mitchell Kemp was an abuser, an attacker, someone who had destroyed her life. But of course these things weren't true. Tausha Fields had just fabricated it to try and, to arrange the whole situation, because she was a manipulative person. And you also see these trends with people who are like the victims of abuse, the victims of kind of just having a lack of bonding with their parents growing up. All of these things that fuel the concept of antisocial behavior. And it teaches the people that the only thing they know how to accept is rejection. So the only thing that they know how to do is to be antisocial. They know how to destroy, but they don't know how to create, and they don't know how to bond. These are just the consistent trends that we have seen with antisocial behavior. But the big thing is, though, the orchestrator of a murderer is horrendously guilty. Pulling the trigger counts for very little in the concept of the law. I mean, if you're the person who is orchestrating the murder and putting false information out to people so that they will commit a murder on your behalf, that is very, very much, it can sometimes even be viewed as worse than the people who are actually pulling the trigger. Notice that Charles Manson is the kind of person you think about with the Manson family, when a lot of other people were committing the actions. But he is the epicenter of it all, the same way that Tausha Fields was the epicenter of all of these activities, the lying, the cheating, the stealing, and, of course, the murder of Mitchell Kemp. So, that's kind of where we are with that one. But what I would also say is that this is something, though, that it's just almost like a statistic. This is almost just something that will happen with humanity, with our societies, because our societies are imperfect, and we are going to have people that are going to be pushed to the fringe, the way like Tausha Fields apparently was. Some of it, though, I don't even necessarily know if you can blame it on unhealed childhood trauma. I think you can also just say greed was a very big factor in this, and perhaps indifference to human life, meaning that she's only caring about her own sort of personal gains. I'm not completely convinced that greed is something that is purely a concept that comes from having a bad childhood. I think that greed can affect people in a variety of different ways from a variety of different backgrounds. But yes, of course, though, it's like, as you see, though, Tausha Fields was sentenced to life in prison, and I mean, I think that is good. I think that is good news, and it's probably for the best that she is going to be serving a long sentence. Otherwise, if it weren't for that, if it weren't for going to prison, she would just continue her cycle of destructive and manipulative behavior. Well, that's all I really have to say about this case for now. I know it's going to be a short upload, but as I mentioned, there are a lot of people aren't really going through a lot of the there's not a lot of analysis that is done about this particular case. I think it's just somewhat lesser known, and we aren't necessarily going to be seeing that with every single true crime case. Some cases are just going to get more attention than others, and I don't even necessarily know if that's just another way that things pan out. And as we said, that thing from First Degree, in the cosmic shuffle of things, certain things happen. I wish I was the originator of that quote, but I'm not. Anyway, what do you have to say about the case of Tausha Fields? And I guess our challenge question for today would be, do you think that greed has its origins in the way that people are raised growing up? Or is it just people are greedy because they want more things than what they currently have, and that's it? I mean, that would be our only challenge question. That's all for me now, and until next time.